All right. So the state of Florida is back at it again, doing things surrounding their education curriculum specifically, where it seems like they've just been on an absolute tear recently and trying to get their education to be as skewed away from reality and towards conservative dogmatism as physically possible. Obviously, under the leadership of the current governor and presidential candidate running a failed presidential campaign right now, Ron DeSantis. And so this is the latest in terms of what they have to offer for the students and the children in the great state of Florida. They say here from USA Today, Florida approves PragerU curriculum, why critics are sounding the alarm on right-wing bias. So for those of you who don't know, PragerU or Prager University, which is just kind of like a byline that they add to their name to try to give it some sense of legitimacy, but this organization is just brazenly right-wing propaganda. I mean, that's like their whole thing, as we're going to get to here in a minute. They don't even really shy away from the idea that their purpose is to like indoctrinate people with the so-called educational content that they are putting out there. So they have a very explicit agenda. This was something that was originally started by like a bunch of right-wing, super wealthy millionaires and billionaires, and some specifically tied to the fossil fuel industry, which is going to get interesting here as we get into some of what their actual content covers. But that is what PragerU is, explicitly right-wing, explicitly a propaganda outlet, and this is what apparently the state legislature thinks kids need to be exposed to. So a little bit of details here to start us off from this USA Today article. They say Florida schools have approved the use of supplemental curriculum created by PragerU, an unaccredited right-wing advocacy group that seeks to offer an alternative to the, quote, dominant left-wing ideologies in classrooms days after the State Department of Education approved new controversial academic standards for the Black History curriculum. So, when they say dominant left-wing ideologies, what exactly do they mean there, right? Because I'm only 23 years old right now. I obviously recently went through the the schooling system here in the United States of America, and believe it or not, I was never exposed to any communist professors or teachers. I was never exposed to any socialist professors or teachers. At the very most, you would get somebody who was like aware of the actual history of the United States and taught it in an honest way, or maybe they're accepting of the existence of LGBTQ people within this country, and that's pretty much the extent of it. Maybe you'd also get some people who are more left-leaning when it comes to like economic policy, and they're sort of like social democrats or whatever, but these are not like dominant left-wing ideologies, right? Capitalism is still taught as the default in all of these universities and all of these high school curriculum courses on economics, right? We understand what the U.S. education system is actually for, right? It is for specifically churning out good little worker bees who can go out and be exploited by the capitalist class, right? That is sort of like what the whole thing is with the education here in the United States. But they will look at some teachers, they will look at some professors who are sort of just, again, amenable to the existence of LGBTQ people, or want to talk about the history of chattel slavery and Jim Crow laws and their long-lasting effects in terms of systemic racism in this country, and they will say that is radical, woke, leftist, communism, Marxism, whatever other buzzwords that you want to throw out there. And so this is basically the alternative that it looks like a lot of these reactionary conservatives are trying to push forward. So a little bit of more details in terms of PragerU. They say here, who founded PragerU? Well, PragerU was founded in 2009 by Alan Estrin and conservative radio talk show host Dennis Prager, who is obviously like sort of the face of this enterprise. And if you get more specific in terms of the actual money behind this, it becomes a lot more clear in terms of what PragerU actually stands for. So here from the Daily Dot, a little bit of info on that. They say PragerU, short for Prager University, though it is not an accredited institution of higher learning, preaches old world conservatism where men are masculine, abortion is illegal, the Civil War wasn't about slavery, systemic racism is a myth, everything socialist is evil, and taxes are best kept low, particularly for the rich, to its converts, most of whom are young. They say most of its presenters are over their 40s, but many of PragerU's most recognizable stars are fresh-faced millennials, like Ben Shapiro, Steven Crowder, Candace Owens, Will Witt, and Charlie Kirk, who were all born after 1983, and its mission sounds like a line from Bill and Ted movie: to promote what is true, what is excellent, and what is noble, through digital media. Okay, and this of course just applies to whatever standard that they think is true and they think is excellent and they think is noble. They say, but for all the slick youth that PragerU portrays, its roots lie in Grey Gardens. The 5 men whose money propelled PragerU's meteoric rise are neither hip nor young. They're elderly, ultra-rich, and ultra-conservative. The youngest is in his 60s. The youngest is in his 60s, right? 2 are in their 80s. The poorest, Michael Levin, has an estimated net worth of $11 million. That's the poorest amongst them. Leroy Mitchell, the next poorest, is worth $250 million. 3, Sheldon Adelson and brothers Dan and Ferris Wilkes are billionaires, and cumulatively they control $42 billion, 2 more billion dollars than the GDP of oil-rich Bahrain. They say these 5 and founder Dennis Prager, a 71-year-old conservative talk show host, have less in common with PragerU's many collegiate fans than they do with their grandparents. Their conservatism is a throwback to the narrow-minded era from which they sprung, in which business interests trumped the individual. Identity politics were an anathema, and the good old days were actually good and definitely not racist, misogynist, and oppressive. So that's a little bit of info in terms of who the people are who are actually backing this, who they are sort of front-loading in terms of their faces for this brand, and what they're actually trying to accomplish. Now, a little bit more specifics in terms of what they are alleging in terms of the woke indoctrination that needs to be supplanted by PragerU's curriculum. They say PragerU believes that American schools are indoctrinating students who are being taught radical ideas about critical race theory, systemic racism. And keep in mind, Ron DeSantis, I covered this on this channel at the time, he had a lawyer who actually went into court to defend one of the policies he was pushing through the Florida state legislature, and they essentially argued that their definition of critical race theory means acknowledging the existence of systemic racism. Okay, so this is what they're talking about here, right? It's not some extreme where they're saying, okay, we shouldn't be teaching kids that, the young white kids, that they should feel guilty for the crimes of their ancestors and that's bad. No, they're talking about just any discussion, an honest discussion about systemic racism in the United States of America. That in and of itself is indoctrination, and we need to fight back against it, right? So they're pushing back against reality. They are pushing back against history in and of itself. But they're also saying that the radical ideas, in addition to critical race theory and systemic racism, also include gender fluidity, anti-Americanism, and that math is racist. Again, I just went through the entire schooling system. Nobody ever told me that math was racist. Not exactly sure what they're referring to there. But anti-Americanism, this is, again, one of those things, right? They want to teach a history where the United States is always the good guy. Maybe we'll have some uncomfortable conversations about some of our ills in the past, but we're not really going to frame them as ills like we recently talked about with something good coming out of slavery, which is apparently part of the adjustment that they're trying to make within the state of Florida, where some black people may have learned some useful skills while they were slaved, and essentially just trying to whitewash that history, right? That's how they want to frame these discussions. They want to frame the United States as the good guy. All of these other, especially left-leaning countries throughout history, they're all the evil baddies, and essentially that is the black and white dichotomy that something like PragerU wants to set up, right? And so any discussion that potentially could reflect badly on the United States of America throughout our history, that is anti-Americanism and needs to be removed from the curriculum, according to a lot of these conservatives. But they say that it says, PragerU, that it has designed its curriculum to provide both sides of the argument and help kids understand history, economics, foreign affairs, and philosophy. So, again, when they say they want to provide both sides of the argument, they're not talking about let's have both sides of the argument in terms of the detailed nuances of what the Federal Reserve policy should be. No, they're talking about we're going to provide both sides of the argument on slavery in the United States, right? That's what they're actually referring to there. So it's pretty clear exactly what they stand for. Now, a couple more specific examples here in terms of why some people are pushing back against this kind of curriculum being included in the State Department of Education's outline here. They say Joseph McCarthy of The Weather Channel in 2016 wrote an entire feature on PragerU's video called, quote, "Fossil Fuels, the Greenest Energy." Let me say that again for you guys, okay? They actually released a video that the title was Fossil Fuels, the Greenest Energy, right? This is what we're dealing with here. Keep in mind, some of the original founders of Prager University literally made their wealth from fracking, okay? And they're making videos called Fossil Fuels, the Greenest Energy. I could probably think off the top of my head, if I really strain myself, of some greener energies than fossil fuels. It's almost as if like the entire reason we're having conversations about climate change is because of fossil fuels. But no, apparently those are the greenest energy, and maybe we need to adjust our policy on the left here. We don't need a Green New Deal. We just need to double and triple and quadruple down on fossil fuels, according to PragerU. Okay, it says that this has garnered 1.5 million views at the time that he reviewed it. And McCarthy wrote that the video was presented by a proponent of fossil fuel, Alex Epstein, and that the video flubs a major date and soberly transitions between obvious inaccuracies and out-of-context claims. So exactly the kind of stuff that you want to be teaching to young kids, right? They got another one here. They say Paul Gottfried in 2017 wrote a story in the American Conservative lambasting PragerU presenter Dinesh D'Souza for claiming that fascism was a left-wing idea. This guy, Dinesh D'Souza, was the same guy, I believe, who came out with that documentary, 2000 Mules, about how the 2020 election was stolen. Okay, give you a little bit of insight in terms of this guy's mental capacity here, but he claimed that fascism was a left-wing idea. D'Souza claimed that it could be proven that it was a leftist idea by examining the political writings of Mussolini's court philosopher Giovanni Gentile. Okay, so referencing Mussolini, one of the most famous, right-wing fascists throughout the history of the world, as an example of how fascism is actually a leftist ideal, right? Okay, so I mean, again, PragerU, they're not sending their best. They're not exactly portraying history. They're not exactly portraying these conversations in an honest light, to say the least. This is just one other screen grab that I've always thought was funny from a PragerU video. I mean, this basically gives you the amount of insight that PragerU is going to give you. This is the strength of their argument, right? Capitalism, large bar, much larger than the socialism bar over here, because of course socialism is evil and bad, and so it is half as large as the capitalism bar. What does this mean? I don't know. Doesn't need to mean anything, because that's kind of what they do over there at PragerU. Now, on top of this, we also have, obviously, this coming in the wake of a lot of these conservatives, including Ron DeSantis himself, claiming that the education departments around the United States of America are indoctrinating children. Well, let's get an update in terms of how PragerU views themselves and the concept of indoctrination. So here is pointed out by Philip Lewis. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis repeatedly says that he opposes indoctrination in schools. However, his administration has approved educational materials from PragerU, whose founder says that it is fair to say that they indoctrinate children. I'm not even kidding here. Direct quote. Quote, "We are in the mind-changing business, and few groups can say that," Prager says in a promotional video for PragerU as a whole. He reiterated that sentiment this summer at a conference for the conservative group Moms for Liberty, which is one of the most psychotic groups in the country, in Philadelphia, saying that it is fair to say that PragerU indoctrinates children. He says, quote, "It's true, we bring doctrines to children, but what is bad about our indoctrination?" So this is what this boils down to, right? When conservatives are coming out here and saying these liberals, these leftists, these Marxists are indoctrinating our children, really what it points out to, and maybe you have some edge cases on this, I want to be fair about it, but really what it boils down to is they do not want an accurate teaching of American history. They don't want anything that is legitimately critical about the structures and the institution and the founding of this country to be taught to our kids. They don't want any concepts such as like gender fluidity or sexuality or any of these other things taught to our kids, because that reality, that real history actually, could tend to have some sense of like dismantling the power structures that exist within this country and that a lot of conservatives rely on. And so they don't want these things to be discussed. They don't want these things to be taught to future generations. They don't actually oppose indoctrination, right? They just want to indoctrinate kids in their own worldview. And it's pretty clear when you have examples like this. I mean, PragerU literally saying, "We are here to indoctrinate your children into conservative ideology," and Ron DeSantis, who is supposedly against indoctrination, fully going through with this, right? So, I mean, it's not surprising. It's pretty easy to see through, I think, a lot of what their arguments are, but this is the reality of it, right? I mean, again, they're not opposed to indoctrination. They just want to be able to do the indoctrination themselves, right? It's the same concept with like Elon Musk owning Twitter, right? All these conservatives who had a problem with, a private corporation like Twitter being able to censor certain things on their website. And it's like, okay, well, if you actually believe that, then let's apply some standards across the board. Let's bring this under maybe public ownership or something like that and, do it that way. But instead, conservatives were like, no, now we have Elon Musk. Instead of the bad guys who used to be in charge, we now have a good guy who is in charge and he can censor our political opponents. I mean, again, it's like the same concept. They don't actually stand against censorship. They're just against censorship of their guys. They're not actually against against indoctrination. They're just against indoctrination towards a semi, center-left ideology instead of towards a conservative ideology. But, I mean, we also had a couple other stories recently that came out. We had this one, Florida's ban on AP African American Studies. Florida effectively bans AP psychology course over LGBTQ content. College Board says, 350 plus books banned in Florida school districts. So, again, what this really comes down to is, they want to indoctrinate for their own preferred ideology. It just so happens that their ideology happens to, back up the same exact power structures, the same exact structure socioeconomically, politically within this country that they rely on in order to stay in power. And so that's why they don't want to have these conversations. They create these boogeymen of LGBTQ people warping the minds of the children and the critical race theorists and the Marxists and calling Joe Biden a Marxist, right? All of these different completely ridiculous, unfounded claims that they are making. And they are, of course, again, doing this not because they are principally against skewing kids in one direction or another politically as they are growing up, but because they want to supplant their own agenda into the minds of young people so that they can maintain their grip on power.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying